So welcome back, everyone. It's Friday night at Orlando Stoics, and we're reviewing chapter 4 of the book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And the first half of that chapter, I think, is about Stoic relationships. That is, how Stoicism can be used in our relationships, not just romantic relationships, family relationships. The first part of this chapter is about Marcus and his relationships. And we're going to talk about his adopted brother, Lucius, and other things that Marcus was dealing with while he was emperor. So let's just get started with this. The first part of the chapter, I thought it was a good introduction to the history of Marcus Aurelius and his life, that the author, Donald Robertson, starts talking about his relationship with Lucius, who is his adoptive brother. And I think that this is a great introduction to how we can apply Stoicism to our real life issues today. You know, we all have family issues to deal with. Some of us get along better with our families than others, but we all still have issues to deal with. And I am glad to say that in the modern Stoicism movement, there are two Stoics in the Midwest. I know Joe has heard of them, Greg Sadler and Andy Siaka, or Siaka. They are actually partners in life, and they have made a video about Stoic relationships. You can actually find it on the, I think they recorded that at Stoicon X Milwaukee a couple of years back. But today, I think if we practice Stoicism in relationships, we can help calm certain problems, whether it's a family issue, brothers and sisters, or whether it's in marriages. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that it facilitates relationships. And specifically, the thing that I liked so much about this particular chapter with Marcus and his brother Lucilius is that he still had a way of identifying the good things in Lucilius, meaning he was behaving in a way that maybe wasn't based on virtue. But he said, it gave me an example that is what I don't want to be. And so he still found the positive in it. And he still found ways to actually try and make things work with his brother as often as possible. And, you know, sometimes we have some struggles in our families. And I think taking a virtue-based approach to our relationships in our families, it's a good reminder. I thought that was a perfect example of how, how Marcus handled his brother on a regular basis. Just by, he put him in charge of in certain things, and always found out like that he was maybe disappointed in how his brother handled those things, but he never lost his temper, and he really still was able to maintain a relationship with him till the end.
And that's a great segue to the next part, where we have to remember that Lucius and his claim to the throne, if he had been ignored, it could have caused a civil war, which would have been very destructive, very expensive in terms of human lives. And so in context, it's important to see this in our imagination, that Marcus Aurelius was like the senior emperor or the older brother, and the younger brother was Lucius, and they both ruled together, but this situation was set up really by Antoninus, the previous emperor, who was also kind of like the philosopher, thinker. And I think that he and Marcus may have had a closer relationship because Antoninus's character of reasoning and philosophy was very similar to Marcus.
Yes, and I think that that's absolutely true. But there's also another important underlying lesson, is that we don't choose who our family members are. I mean, in this particular case, yes, there was an adopted brother, but we were handed our family as is, and we have to make it work. And Marcus does that as best as he can.
Right. Now, to look at the dark side of Lucius, in the chapter, Donald describes how he really was a party goer and gave extravagant gifts to people. I think that today we still see, interestingly, in modern society, we still see this huge contrast of how some wealthy people live, how celebrities live, and how they're spending money at a rate that really the average person like us cannot comprehend. But I like that how Donald Robertson does say that these luxuries and these gifts are neutral things. They're not good or bad. It's how we use them that really is important. And one of Donald's quotes from psychology is that, quote, people confuse happiness with pleasure. That's a great quote that's really one of our takeaways from today is how this is still an issue today in modern society.
I think this is the point of the chapter, and I think the way he puts it into context in the form of the story between Lucius and Marcus is really hits home, and it's the idea that when we're chasing pleasure, that it's a transient thing, that it's not something that is sustainable. It is ultimately something that is a more passive way of enjoying yourself. So in the sense that you're receiving some kind of bodily pleasure by drinking or or going out to eat or eating too much and not demonstrating the virtue of temperance. And I think that that's really important because he even calls out that it's a form of emotional avoidance. You're avoiding something. And that was a really critical point in the chapter because he talks about that how Lucilius was actually just running from things and that he may have been dealing with anxiety issues, depression issues, and some even alcoholism. So that these things are actually self-destructive in nature. And that's the most important part, is that by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, you're actually engaging in self-destructive behavior. And that this will ultimately is not only detrimental to the people around you, it also comes back on your own personal happiness and fulfillment. And so I think that this is it's a beautiful example of showing how you can have authentic happiness, which actually needs to come from within. And that is once you're identifying what your core values are. The Stoics really did this well. That that you could identify your core values, what is most important to you. You become more aware about yourself, and then you really start to understand what true happiness is, eudaimonia, as the Stoics would call it.
Right. And this observation that you're making is not only something taught by the Stoics, by Donald Robertson and other modern day people, but we also have to remember there's this the term conspicuous consumption was created not by a philosopher, but that term came from an economist named Thorstein Veblen. He's got a really complicated name, Thorstein Veblen, but I kind of file it away in my brain because it's hard to say, like conspicuous consumption. And he came up with this idea because he observed in his work as an economist that people who did this thing, conspicuous consumption, that they were on a kind of a treadmill, a never-ending treadmill,
right.
Wanting more wealth, more of everything, never satisfied. That's quite a philosophical conclusion.
It is, and it's a really important one in a consumer-based society where we have technologies that are trying to make us, trying to addict us to their platforms. And I think that being aware of that is not going to lead to long-term happiness is important in today's age more than ever before. I think that we were tempted before, but now we have new ways of even psychologically hacking in people where we're tapping into their desires. And I think that that this is why Stoicism is so important in this day and age, because you have to really recognize, is this something that is worth pursuing? Is this wise to pursue?
Right. Now we've talked a little bit about the dark side of Lucius, but of course he had a good side as well towards Marcus. He was very loyal to him. Right. And I think this again shows us a kind of a contrast like we've seen in earlier chapters of this book, where we can see one side and another side the way Donald tells the story, I think is correct. Lucius was very loyal to Marcus. And, this was also confirmed by other scholars. I remember a couple of years back, I had the chance to interview Christopher Gill, who's an amazing historian and Stoic in the modern period. And Christopher Gill knows a lot about the details of Marcus's life. And so he also illustrated this, this contrast that Lucius had good and bad sides, but the good side of Lucius was great loyalty to Marcus, maybe like a little brother looks up to his older brother.
That's and that's an important point, because as I mentioned a little bit earlier before, it's Marcus's ability, and you see this in book one so clearly, is his ability is to see the best in each individual and what they actually add to him. And even if Lucius was actually not behaving in a virtuous way, he still was an example of Marcus still used him as an example as to what not to be. So he still found a way to see something in him, even though that's not necessarily something you would want to strive for. But nonetheless, I think that the loyalty aspect of it is really important as well. I mean, it really kind of shows you that despite all the troubles that he had, he still remained loyal to Marcus, and that was something that he could have easily, somebody that is that erratic with their behavior could easily turn on you very quickly. So it is worth noting. Right.
And about midway in chapter 4, Donald reviews the book called Memorabilia by Xenophon. This book, Memorabilia, it wasn't talked about too much, 5 years ago, but I think that they've discovered more links between this and modern Stoicism. This is, of course, the book. Xenophon's Memorabilia is the famous book that supposedly Zeno read when he was shipwrecked. He walked into Athens, he walked into a bookstore, and that's one of the books that he saw and that got him interested in philosophy in general. Of course, we're all appreciative of this kind of event because it led to the creation of Stoicism in 300 BC approximately. But this this quote from Memorabilia that Donald uses is a quote of Socrates saying, "Wickedness can be had in abundance easily." Now, it's amazing. This quote is such a timeless one because even today, we all know how easy it is to go out and do things that are crazy and going to extremes. Alcoholism, we've already talked about it with Lucius. Think of how that every day when you get up, you have a kind of a road in front of you. You can choose one fork or the other. And it's harder to choose virtue over vice, but it's much more, the payoff is much better.
Yeah, and it's a great example of avoidance. What are you avoiding? That we're looking at here. When we essentially have this choice, are we making this choice just simply based on some short-term payoff, and are we really just avoiding something that is really going to be fulfilling and lead to a life that's worth living, that is something is repeatable as well? And I think that that's a really important part, because habits are really critical when you're talking about cultivating virtue. And if you have a habit of just seeking pleasure, that will not necessarily be sustainable. So I think that over the long term, it's not only over the short term that you have this this happiness that you can achieve, but it's a sustainable way of living. I think that's a really important part.
I find it fascinating that this idea of either seeking wisdom or seeking pleasure is such a profound choice, A or B, because that pleasure part is easy usually, but as the Buddhists say, you form an attachment to it, and then without those pleasures, you'll suffer. But the Stoics, on the other hand, they say by seeking wisdom, you will end up finding that elusive thing called Stoic joy, which is we don't picture Stoics being joyful, but that is the hard sought thing of joy that we can't experience internally.
This is my favorite part of the chapter, actually, is that where he does say, he goes through, there are three areas where, contemplating virtue as far as joy. And when you're contemplating virtue, you're focused on letting go of external things. And that's, one of those. The others are contemplating the virtue in others. We talked a little bit about that already, where you're seeing the best in others. And the other is embracing your fate. And those were the three that he had noted. But I really like the way you put it, in the sense that when you're, looking at, you're not attached to external things any longer. That's really important, because, and that's a concept that's used in a lot of different philosophies of life. But the more attached we become to the things, the more the things dictate who we are. And that's really not healthy. We become attached to the forms. And it's really not, it prevents us from actually flourishing. So.
Great, flourishing. Yeah, so next time we're going to, next Friday, we're going to get into the second part of this chapter, and that's about controlling desires, if I remember right. So it's a great segue from where we are now. But we do invite you all back. You can attend Orlando Stoics on Friday nights. It's an open meeting, open to all, or you can subscribe to the YouTube channel to continue getting these videos. Thanks, Joe, for having this dialogue with me today.
Oh, thank you, Dan. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to the meetup.
Subscribe to this channel to hear about new videos. Follow us on social media for more info. Visit StoicDan.com.